Good evening, everyone. Monday, March 21st, 2022. Time for episode 35 of The Last Admiral. We'll take off where we left off. Go back just a tad. Okay. The Bay Sioux smelled their victims and knew that they lay just beyond the vegetation between them. Initially, they tried to burst through the shrubs that appeared so flimsy and insignificant, but hedges are much more tenacious and deeply rooted than they appear. Smashing into the barrier, the first wave of caretakers was confounded. Now, Umlanu cried, and 12 islanders hurled their barbs, some striking flesh, while others were lost in the darkness. The Bay Sioux then bent low and began to dig and rend the earth, intent upon uprooting the obstacle. Their strength was terrible to behold, and their viciousness fed their fury. Again, Umlanu called out, hurling their javelins repeatedly. They dared to stand as the horde pressed in. Umlanu was a mountain of a man, thick, wider, and more powerful than any other warrior of his tribe was. He remembered his father, who was once a man stronger still. It was now his job and his fate to lead. Fu stood between his nephew Ednaf and Minda, his niece. Teenagers almost of marrying age, they awkwardly wore suits of chainmail at least one size too large. Only their trust in their grandfather gave them the courage to remain. Spears, javelins, and archery were all familiar to them, and the armory's weapons were of a size and weight similar to their own. Well did their barbs find their marks. Fu's might was a miraculous thing to behold, for often his javelins would pass through the bodies of 2 or more enemies before stopping. Valiantly they stood, killing many, but the swarm seemed to be endless, and where 10 fell, 20 more would take their place. The hedge gave way, just as their missiles were exhausted. Adrenaline rushing, their fear unfettered, they took up their long spears as the battle lines joined. Trick, now mounted upon Big Ben, rode out of the stable with his great lance, silver helm, and tall shield, bearing the 12 red crosses symbolizing the branches of his noble family. Gregory, he commanded, bar the doors behind me and mind the animals. Keep an ear on the door in case anyone needs to retreat this way. Luck to you, wavy-haired Gregory said to him as he swung the doors wide and then closed them back again as Trick rode out. The sounds of battle, warriors' screams, and other more hideous emanations were reaching the barn now, and the livestock kicked and pressed against their fetters as their fears grew. Running to the cellar door, he entered and tried to calm them, but he had to be careful, as the animals were panicked and uncontrollable. Realizing that he could do no more for them, he closed the door and returned to the barn's entrance. Keeping watch through the cracks in the planking, he prayed for victory. The southern school now crossed the little brook that powered the hydraulics room and flowed through the mansion. Some of them slithered along the stream bed and under its cast iron bridge, while the largest group climbed the muddy embankment and tore down the wooden stalk fence that blocked their advance. Sehoy, their leader, drove them forward, urging them into a wide drainage ditch and over a mound of earth that bisected the pasture there. Cresting the hill, the defenders met them. Diego, the carpenter, led a group of 6 warriors against them. Not many, to be sure, but the Bay Sioux had to claw their way up the muddy embankment, making them easy targets for the islander or archers as they rose above it. Watching his struggling school, Sehoy summoned the dark powers at his command. Fell magic, gifted to the greatest among them by their devilish elder gods. Working his claws, he summoned a thick fog that rolled about them, obscuring their bodies and making them difficult targets. "Move up," Diego ordered. "Use your spears." And so they did. pressing forward into the darkening mist in search of their enemies. Yago reached the top of the mound first. Struggling to see, he choked and wheezed in reaction to the rotten, sulphuric stench of the devilish creatures. His eyes widened in terror as a massive, scaly, 8-foot-tall beast reared up before him. Preparing his thrust, he was too slow, and the monster struck him across the chest, hurling him backward for many yards. Landing in a heap, he lay unmoving. Barely conscious, he could not breathe. Many screams then rang out from within the fog, and Yago knew that his islanders were dying. He wanted to rise, to fight, to help, but he could not. If only he could breathe. If only. Trick saw Yago's fall and heard the dying screams of his fighters. "Come on, Ben," he urged. Intelligent and well-trained, Ben would follow the commands of his rider's legs and feet as he guided them forward. Riding in beside Yago, he saw that he still lived. Silence from within the mist told him that his fellows were most likely all dead. But he did not dare ride blindly over where they could be, and soon he did not have to. The Bay Sioux, having regrouped, emerged from the mist, and a singular, 14-foot-tall abomination led them. "Onward, Ben," he cried. "We charge." The rain poured down, relentless, turning the field to mud, soaking his livery and padding to the skin. Alone and vastly outnumbered and likely doomed, they rode into the midst of the host, hooves churning, nostrils flaring, and warrior screaming. Hugely powerful, Ben kicked any monster that dared to come too near, turned, reared, and leaped at his master's command. Corrupt bodies of the Bay Sioux fell all about the field around them, discharging noxious gases and spoiling the earth with their blood. A knight of high training and unparalleled skill, he battled with instincts that he had thought to be long lost, but they remained there, merely buried deep, sunken in deference to the peaceful life that he had come to know. Striking fast and moving, he could see the wretched, yellowish gases as they clung and drifted evilly about the low areas and pockets of the ground all about the field. But always his target was the mighty creature that led them, nearly twice the size and might of all the rest. Sehoy saw him coming, and the sight of all the caretakers that he had killed enraged him. "Yes, mortal," he hissed. Come to me." Trick and Ben churned ahead at full gallop, a single knight against a terrible foe. Leaning forward in the saddle, he trained his lance toward Sehoy's heart, if indeed a heart he had. The swarming terrors lunged at them from all sides, slashing with their razor-sharp claws and snapping pincer-toothed maws. Both knight and steed received 100 glancing blows, struck upon armor and barding of mail, cut here and torn there, blood flowing freely and mingling as one. Was it strength of body that then sustained them, or some power of the spirit within? Likely it was both, for few warriors or beasts could have withstood such an assault. Lance met flesh, just as rending claws reached rider. Big Ben slammed forward, kicking, falling, and struggling amid the mass of Bay Sioux and man. Tumbling together, Sehoy fell backward into the ditch behind them, biting and tearing at his victims, even as his own life's blood spilled out. Ben rolled to his feet, wounded but not killed. Stomping upon Sehoy's body, he whirled about the ditch in defense of his master. Sehoy, in his death throes, clamped his pincers tightly about his victim's shoulders and embedded his mandibles more deeply into his flesh. Feeling Trick's body squirming beneath him, he released his poison into his slayer and slowly died. Fighting to free himself, Trick felt the burning venom flowing into his veins. First it stole his strength and then his sight. Strangely, he could hear Ben still battling around himself. His pain was beginning to fade, and he knew what that meant. Smiling with his love for his horse and its love of him, he could do no more. That's a tough one to read. Anyway, that's the drawing he did of Trick and Big Ben. You can see it there. Fighting the terrible Seahoy monster. Okay. Alright. Where were we? Diego's breath had returned. His ribs hurt more with every inhalation, but he could once again move. Struggling to his feet, he searched for his weapons, but only his sheathed sword remained with him. His badly sprained left ankle could barely support his weight. Looking desperately around himself, he tried to anticipate the flow of the battle. Beasts were swarming over the stone-lined wash of the brook towards the mansion, and 3 terrified defenders hiding behind a nearby hedgerow. "Fall back to the barn," he cried, pointing urgently. "Get out of there!" Hobbling along, he dared a hopping, limping kind of lope that managed to keep pace ahead of the advancing horde. They reached the barn together. "Gregory," he hollered, "the door! Open the door!" The door opened quickly, with Gregory's strength behind it, and they poured in, closing it and barring it behind themselves. "There are more fighters along the west walls," Diego said, gasping with exertion, "but I can't reach them in time." "I'll go," Gregory replied, with resolve. "If you can't return, then use the back entrance. We'll wait here and guard the barn for as long as we can." Opening the door again, Gregory bolted outside. Daring to look, he knew that he would never make it back before the Besu cut him off. Running alongside the wall, he turned left around the west corner and ran on between the barn and the stockyard fence. Flashes of red in the darkness beyond it told him that the monsters had encircled the entire estate. He found the brave group of islanders guarding their positions along the west wall, with a hedgerow before them and a flower bed with a 3-foot retaining wall beyond that. A large, kidney-shaped goldfish pond rested further out and past that, the swift, wide brook that fed the mansion. "We've got to fall back inside," he implored. "It's too late," Ian explained. "They are already here." Just then, Gregory became aware of the dreadful presences around them as the creatures' own bodies flashed red in anticipation of the kill. "Watch the north flank," Ian directed. "Now we fight." Average in height and of build, Ian was a thoughtful, polite man and steady under pressure. 9 of the tribe's best warriors stood spaced out to his left, wielding bows, arrows, and long spears. They killed many of the Besu as they tried to breach the obstacles. The caretakers broke through first in the southwest corner. "Fall back to me," Ian yelled, but the reins were so heavy that his voice did not carry to them all. Swarming through the opening and passing over the small bridge that spanned the creek bed, the Besu attacked their weaker flank. Defending their positions bravely, the fight soon went against them, forcing their retreat. Overwhelmed with a fear so great that they froze, 3 of them stood, unable to move, as the horde then swarmed over them and ripped them to pieces. "Form a line," Ian commanded. "On me." Now reduced to 8 warriors, including Gregory, they fought desperately, and for a time they held the line against many. The Eastern School was now in full command of the eastern and southern fronts. There could be no escape through them. Their prey continued to strike at them from a distance, hiding as they were behind their walls of green. Hung Hak, their leader, led a separate group against them from the west, cunningly working his swarm around the hedges and the stone-lined creek bed that hindered their progress. His magic was the greatest among them. He used it to paralyze his victims with fear or turn them against themselves in confusion, and he invoked these forces. Fu's niece Mora stood in battle beside her brothers, Itu and Fela, when trouble erupted among their company's west flank. Mora was a tall, strong, and beautiful girl of marrying age. Her hair and eyes were glossy and dark, and she was known for her skill and courage in cliff diving. Itu and Fela bore a strong family resemblance to her, and they were within a few years of her age. Clothed as they were in black Dragonian armor, they blended strongly with the dark of night, and only their exposed faces and hands shone by the fire's light and flashing storm. Nearby to their right, siblings suddenly turned against one another in some terror-induced psychosis, driving their spears into each other's hearts as if their opponents were the Besu themselves. 4 islanders fell in this manner before anyone noticed. "What devilry is this?" Mora said desperately to her brothers. "Some evil spell has befallen them," Itu replied. The Eastern School then pushed forward unopposed, breaching the barriers and encircling them. "Go back to the courtyard," Mora cried. "We can't stop them now." 19 warriors still fought outside, guarding the front door to the mansion, and 7 more protected the back door. Fully in control, the caretakers concentrated their efforts, pressing in violently, inexorably. Then, in that darkest hour, the mansion itself resembled nothing more than an anthill, surrounded by the swarm. The Southern School advanced in chaos, their leaders slain, but soon the next strongest entity took command, an all-black devil named Gaidan. "That one is dead," he said about Trick. "Move south and tear the buildings down." Straining against the pressing horde, the barn's doors were soon to fail. Diego thought to reinforce it, but there was no time. Gregory was still out there. Had he sent the lad to his doom? "Fall back to the cellar," he directed his comrades grimly. "Run!" The doors swelled and cracked, finally exploding inward as the caretakers swarmed in. Demolishing everything in their path, they tore down the wooden stalls, smashing barrels and assailing the support beams. Gaidan screeched in anger and frustration when the building proved to be both vacant and resilient. They fled down this way, an underling said to him while pointing to the cellar door. Sturdily built and iron-bound, it was a formidable obstacle, and its placement at the back of a short entrance tunnel prevented more than one creature from passing through it at one time. "Smash it down," Gaidan commanded. Fu and his father had killed countless foes, but many of their warriors were now injured and needed assistance to escape from the battlefield. Adeline sent out reinforcements and fought to support them with archery from the breezeway. Umlenu's line fought well, but its south flank was collapsing inward, as only young Mora and her brothers defended it. Inevitably, they all fell back toward the colonnaded entrance and its twin stone guardians flanking its stairs. All around them, the air grew thicker with the deadly fumes emitted from the Besu's dying bodies and other insidious odors that they released intentionally. Those warriors who breathed in too much of it or stood very long within it seared their lungs and blistered their skin. 5 brave warriors succumbed to it and collapsed beneath the horde. Torn apart and devoured, they vanished within the host. Lily fashioned a makeshift hospital in the parlor and kitchen areas. Wounded fighters cried out in pain all around them, while those that could did tend them. She was a fair nurse, but no doctor, and she had never seen such injuries before. Working with the children and those too old to fight, they cleaned wounds and rinsed poison off burned skin. Bandaging and splinting broken bones, they did what they could. Lily's fear grew as she realized that without a miracle, none of them were likely to escape. Tear me more bandages from this cloth, she instructed the brave islander boy who helped her. Quickly! The sounds of battle were very close now. Just outside the door, and the mansion's walls shook with vibrations and blows like thunder. Gregory and his fighters retreated inside, barricading the back door. Every other entrance is blocked or barred, Song informed them as they entered. Where are all of the others? Hien shook his head. They're trying to tear through the walls, Song cried with dread. Many of the children are already waiting in the escape tunnel. Where are my brothers? Hien asked. They are still fighting in the courtyard, Song replied, but I haven't heard anything about them in a while. I must go to them. We're with you, Gregory announced, speaking for them all. Racing through the mansion's halls, they came through the parlor and joined Adeline and a few others on the breezeway. The monstrous swarm was now a dark, ever-gathering mass that extended into the impenetrable night on every side and all around them. Lanu and his people had fought well, but the sheer size of the horde was beyond them. Fall back inside, he commanded. Fu and Lanu fought backward, shoulder to shoulder, until they reached the stairs and then the foyer. Through valiant and vicious effort, they delayed the swarm while everyone retreated inside. Mere paces from the front doors himself, a grasping arm seized Lanu's nephew Dredu, dragging him into the evil host, and the ravenous swarm enveloped him. Powerless to stop it, Lanu could do nothing but continue to fight. The Bei Su was simply too many, driven as they were by one massive 20-foot-tall juggernaut. You will not escape me, Bublix proclaimed, chief of the island people. With a click and a chirr, Bublix invoked his power and froze him with fear. Tear off his limbs, Bublix clacked, but then another, smaller human moved to stand between him and death. You dare to defy me, spawn of Lanu? Seize him, he is mine. Bublix then summoned his dark sorcery against Fu, but something protected the islander prince, some strange force of the sea. Fu lashed out with his spear, his feet, and his fists, giant strength coursing through his body, and soon caretaker corpses began to pile up all around him. Bublix refused denial. Slug-like, he slithered forward, reaching out with his 6-foot-wide talons in order to cleave this insignificant foe and claim his prize. Fu, wounded and yet strong beyond measure, still possessed the fragile body of a mortal, and his lungs could withstand the wretched gases of the battlefield no longer. Spinning his long spear about himself like a whirlwind, he cleared a wide path around himself and then bent low to pick up his father. Carrying him bent over his shoulders, he knocked nearby opponents aside, reached the stairs, and then rushed through the doors. Barring the doors behind him, the Bei Su assailed the mansion, battering portals, walls, and windows in their frenzy. Bring it down, Bublix commanded. Smash it apart. Crack open their shell. Inside, the building shook and groaned beneath the siege. Glassware and bowls fell from their shelves. Portraits tumbled from the walls and unstable furniture crashed down. Move everyone to the escape tunnel, Adeline ordered, just as a calamitous thunderclap that was not thunder splintered the very air outside. What could it be? I have no idea, Fu muttered between gasps for air, keeping his back against the door. His father lay near him and seemed to be rousing. I've never heard that sound before. Outside, a titanic explosion of fire and smoke erupted, flashing against the mansion and searing its outer walls and windows. A short period of quiet and rain ensued, followed by another flash and then another. Despite his trembling terror, Adeline dared to peek outside. A gigantic black shape, darker than the night itself. darker than the night itself, stood embroiled in battle in the midst of the caretaker horde. That's where we'll leave off today's episode. When we return, we'll start with the chapter entitled Acronsis the Black of Shadow. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that reading. That was a tough one. Thank you and have a great night.